Hello and welcome to the first session of our Bible study of the Gospel of John. In this video I plan to give an introduction to the Gospel of John. For those of you doing the online study with me, please note that this is the only pre-recorded session, as from the next session the Bible study will be live streamed. In this session I'd like to achieve two goals. Firstly, I'd like to give an overview of the Gospel to help when we get into the details of the book. And secondly, I'd like us to consider an approach for doing the study. Before we start, I'd like to mention that much has been written about the Gospel of John, but with little consensus. So while I've drawn on various commentators, I've also tried to develop my own thoughts, and I will point this out as we go, so you can form your own opinions. I suggest we hold things quite lightly in the study and don't get too attached to dogmatic ideas. Let's start with goal number one, which is an overview of the Gospel. To do that, we will cover three topics. Firstly, we'll look at the context, that is, who wrote it, why it was written, and so on. Then we'll look at the major themes or the content of the book. Then we'll look at what I call the craft of the book, or the way in which it's written. So let's jump right in. Are you ready to go? So we start with the context, and particularly the question of who wrote the book. Well, it's not so obvious because the text does not actually tell us who wrote it. We do have some clues, however, in the final chapters. They tell us of a mysterious disciple described as the disciple loved by Jesus, or the beloved disciple as he is known. This mysterious disciple is important because right at the end of the Gospel, we learn that this disciple wrote the Gospel. It's kind of a nom de plume for the author. We thus have a puzzle. If we identify this beloved disciple, we probably have found the author. Well, what do we know of this beloved disciple? He sat next to Jesus at the Last Supper. He thus has a place of honor. As Jesus was dying, he asks this disciple to take care of his mother. He accompanied Peter to the empty tomb, and he was present when the resurrected Jesus met his disciples on the shores of Galilee. Now, John certainly is a candidate. He was in the inner circle of disciples, and the traditional view of the early church was that John was the author. Many will accept this view, but there are other ideas. One alternative theory is that it was written by James, the brother of Jesus. It would make sense for Jesus, the oldest brother, to ask his younger brother to take care of his mother. There is even a record from early traditions which claims that Jesus' brothers were present at the Last Supper. And James was the early leader of the young Christian church, so I think it's a viable option also. But there's a twist right at the end of the Gospel where the author refers to the beloved disciple in the third person. He says we know his testimony to be true. Now, this seems rather odd, doesn't it? One theory is that someone else put together the Gospel using material written by the author. But it's also possible that the author is just using some kind of literary tool here. Now, if that leaves you all confused, don't worry, you are in excellent company. But this is frustrating because we probably will never truly know who the author is. But for the sake of preventing confusion or being burnt at the stake, let's just call our author John. So now let's try and consider when the book was written. Not too long ago, many scholars thought it was a product of the 2nd century AD. However, since then, manuscripts have been found dating back to early in the 2nd century AD, which quote John's Gospel. This means that it's likely that the Gospel would have been written in the 1st century AD. We can narrow it down further. It seems that the Gospel was written after two other events. One is the death of Peter, which happened around 65 AD. The other is the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So we could probably safely settle for a date of about 80 AD, give or take a decade. Now, that's useful because it means that at the time John's Gospel was compiled, there probably would be living people who witnessed the event of Jesus' life. But it also means we are still in the days of the early Christian church, a church in which Jewish Christians still played a prominent role with growing numbers of Gentiles. It also means that the Gospel of John is one of the last books written in the Bible. It comes after all the other Gospels and after the writings of Paul. So let's consider then to whom it was written. If we accept that John did write the book, the traditional view is that he would have written it from Ephesus, which was his home base in later years. Ephesus is in Asia Minor, in the west of present-day Turkey, and John would then be writing to Christians in the same location as the 7 churches of Revelations. This area had a prosperous Jewish diaspora going back many generations. The culture, of course, was Greek, which meant that the early church here was a fusion of Jewish and Greek cultures. John would thus be writing to Jewish Christians as well as Greek Christians. But even if the book wasn't written by John, we can see in the text that it was written to Greeks and Jews. It's obvious the gospel was written to Jews because it's full of Jewish symbols. But if we look carefully, we can see that John is also writing to Greeks. Only Greeks would understand the description of Jesus as the Logos, the word in chapter 1, a well-known concept in Greek philosophy. John surprisingly labels the festivals as the festivals of the Jews. At the very least, this seems like a polite way to explain things to non-Jewish readers. But it wasn't only Jews who had religious festivals, and so perhaps John is recognizing a world in which Jews weren't the dominant culture. So that's who he's writing to an early church consisting of Jews and Greeks immersed in a culture which mainly identified as Greeks, and John skillfully writes to all of these people. Our final background question is, why was the book written? Well, at least John makes this easy. He tells us exactly why it was written in chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, which reads as follows. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. I love the clarity of John's goal. He only revealed his goal right at the end, but it's rather like the landing of the staircase, because all of the preceding chapters and verses lead towards this one goal. Now we move on to consider the content of the book. What's it all about? Well, that's a hard question at the start of our study. So to help us, we're going to use a very simple tool. Here is a word cloud of the 20 most common words of the gospel. It's surprising how much this can reveal. I do apologize if this feels a bit like a plane circling the runway before it comes to land. But let's do our best to draw out some of the key themes. Can you see that half of the words relate to people, or even to God himself? So let's start with that list first. You can't help notice that the gospel is about Jesus. It's no surprise. But what's unique about John's gospel is that it really is about Jesus rather than his teachings. Mostly John leaves it up to the other gospel writers to tell us about Jesus' teachings. John doesn't do much talking about Jesus either. He stands back and allows Jesus to tell us about himself. In fact, the words I am are used by Jesus to describe himself 78 times. They give us the rich sayings of Jesus about himself. I can count 13 I am sayings in John's gospel. I am the bread of life, for example. These are the jewels of John's gospel. And of course, the words I am tell us that Jesus himself is God, which he does claim more than once in the gospel. But John's description of Jesus isn't at a distance. It's personal and intimate. No other book of the Bible is so rich in telling us who Jesus is, and at such a personal level. Then we have a triplet of words, Son, God, and Father. The gospel is not about Jesus alone, but about the Father and the relationship of the Son to the Father. It shows us that Jesus is God's Son. But it's interesting that John seems to have everyone looking for the Father. The Pharisees say to Jesus, "Where is your Father?" Philip says, "Show us the Father." There's a reason for this, of course. When Jesus says, "I am the way," he's telling us he is the way to the Father. This is the very purpose for which Jesus was sent. Then the word man also features strongly. In John's gospel, the word man usually refers to Jesus. It tells us that Jesus is fully man, yet fully God. We know him as Jesus, of course, but in the gospel, he is the man who healed me, or the man who said these things. The question that seems to be on everyone's lip is, who is this man? Let's consider the word disciple then. John's gospel includes all kinds of disciples. It's not just about the 12, it's about women. It's about disciples who would be unknown if John didn't tell us about them. Now, in John's gospel, the disciples' belief takes shape over time, even if it makes them seem quite fragile. The Samaritans believed tentatively at first, but then believed more firmly after Jesus stayed with them. The disciples believed, but only believed fully after the resurrection. Thomas first needed to see the marks on Jesus' body. The gospel thus seems to show belief as a process of being worked out. John doesn't hide the wavering belief. This gives us hope that we too can be disciples, even if we have doubts. Then we see the word Jews. With John, this usually meant religious leaders. John is sometimes accused of being anti-Semitic because of his criticism of the religious authorities. But it was not Jews in general that he criticizes, but rather the hypocrisy of legalistic religion. Jesus doesn't hate Jews. Indeed, he says salvation is through the Jews. But he hates man-made religious systems which imprison us and keep us from God. We see that the world is also a prominent theme, and this makes us think of John 3:16, God so loved the world, which explains God's love for people in the world especially. This gospel is about God and his relationship with his world and how people of the world can be saved. I did warn you we were only going to be looking at the highlights, so let's move on swiftly to other categories of words. Some of the top 20 words seem to relate to the purpose of John's gospel. Think of the 3 words truth, belief, and life. John wants us to believe by revealing truth to us so that we can have life. These 3 words summarize the entire aim of the gospel, but the word truth is the apex here. It hinges on truth. At the very climax of the story, when Jesus is accused of claiming to be God's son, Pilate asks Jesus, what is truth? Well, what a relevant question today. John is telling us that the critical issue to consider and for which we need to search for an answer is on this question of who Jesus really is. Jesus doesn't answer Pilate's question. John wants us to consider this in each generation. But Jesus does say that we shall know the truth and the truth shall set us free. This isn't just an intellectual truth. Jesus says, I am the truth. Truth is personal. It's in Jesus. It's a truth we can know and believe, and it's a truth which leads to life. And so as we wrap up our thoughts on our key themes of John, we see that there are some very ordinary words in the top 20. John is very good at taking ordinary things and making them extraordinary, and we see this also in the words he uses. We can cluster together 4 ordinary words, the words answered, heard, told, and replied. Of course, John's gospel is a dialogue. There's a debate going on, sometimes fiercely contested. And when you see these words, you might even think it's a script for a play, telling us who says what. Well, we'll come back to that idea. What's so special about John is that he draws us into the story. He gives us intimate insights into what people are thinking. He seems to invite us to form our own opinion. We have another 2 ordinary words in the words things and the word does. These speak of action. John says Jesus did many things, and especially miracles, to help us in our faith. Now, remarkably, Jesus gives us permission to believe based on his miracles, even if we are not yet ready to believe his claims. He still does, sometimes reaching out to people today in ways which are clearly miraculous to allow the lost to be drawn to the truth about him. One final word to consider is the word going, which wins the prize for the least expected in our top 20 list. One thing Jesus kept on saying is, I am going to my Father. When Jesus talks about his going, it presupposes his sending. Jesus was sent by God to do something, and he was returning to God. The text tells us he is always mindful of the things he has to do. When accused of breaking the Sabbath, he says he's working as his Father is working. And when his disciples ask him if he's hungry, he says his food is to do God's work. Going to God wasn't just something passive for Jesus, it was Jesus' constant motivation. When he died, he said, it is finished. He'd done all he was asked to do, and it was time for him to go back home. Well, we could carry on forever like this, but I think we'll need to draw the line there. I hope that served its purpose in giving us a reasonable summary of this wonderful book without yet diving too closely into the text. But now it's time to consider the last part of our overview, what I'm calling the craft of John's book, or the way John writes his gospel. It's very skillfully written, but I'd like to point out 2 techniques that John uses which really stands out for me. Firstly, John uses the interesting device of a narrator, which we kind of touched on briefly before. The narrator is on the side, helping us to understand what's going on. Think of Britain's Got Talent, where 2 guys on the stage give us inside information on what's happening. That's what John is doing here. John, of course, would frequently have heard his parents narrate the stories over the Passover meal in his home, or his elders telling the stories in the temple. So when we read the gospel, we can imagine someone in a group of disciples telling the story to the other disciples. That's what's happening here, I think. We are listening not just to a story, but to the telling of a story. Okay, so where do we hear the voice of this narrator? Well, all over once you notice it. The narrator sets the scene in the opening chapter, but also concludes in the last chapter. Sometimes the voice of the narrator is obvious. When we read, many people believed, that's the narrator speaking. Sometimes the narrator almost seems like he has inside information. He knows about the conversation between Jesus and the woman at the well. But the narrator also seems to know what's going on inside people's heads. He explains to us the motives and behaviors of people. Sometimes the voice of the narrator is hard to discern, such as in the dialogue between Jesus and Nicodemus in chapter 3. This chapter subtly transitions from Jesus talking in the first person to someone else talking about Jesus. It leaves us wondering, for example, whether John 3:16 are the words of Jesus or the narrator. Have you ever thought about that? Now, why would John use this approach? Well, it allows John to separate the eyewitness account of others from his own belief and opinions, which come through in the voice of the narrator. But it also tells us that the gospel can't be told by an impassive storyteller. It's told by someone who's transformed by the message. It brings an enthusiasm to the storytelling, but also an integrity and a sincerity to it. The second obvious technique of John is found in his use of symbols and layers of meaning. I personally think this is the standout feature of the gospel. It's full of imagery, whether it's in wine, water, bread, or the grapevine. Surprisingly, he does this without parables. John is interested in action, not just words. He teaches us through actions. Jesus' actions are often symbolic. When he washes the disciples' feet, he asks them, "Do you know what I've done for you?" His miraculous acts don't just meet human needs, they tell us something about Jesus. He multiplies the bread, then he says the bread of life, and compares himself to the manna in the wilderness. It's not that John creates new symbols. Instead, he draws from the rituals and cultures of the time. These become the material used to teach us. In some cases, things are repurposed to teach us new meaning. Water jars become vessels for wine rather than washing hands. Other times, they tell us that the symbols of the Old Testament were always pointing towards Jesus. Think of the Passover lamb, for example. And of course, many symbols and traditions in the text we do recognize from the Old Testament. But John also draws from Jewish traditions we won't find in the Bible, such as Jacob's well and possibly even Miriam's well. And we should be aware that in some cases, John may have Greek traditions in mind rather than Jewish traditions. Think of the invalid waiting for the water to be stirred up, seemingly like magic. Well, where would that come from? Besides these, John uses many other techniques borrowed from Greek cultures. Think of the irony of Nicodemus, who struggles to understand Jesus' teaching, yet Jesus calls him the teacher of Israel. Think of the long discourses of Jesus in the fine tradition of dramatic Greek oratory, with Jesus on the center stage. 5 discourses make up nearly a quarter of the gospel. Think also of how John plants clues that we can pick up later, like breadcrumbs leading us on. In the wedding of Cana, he says to his mother, "It's not my time." Of course, that makes us look forward to the time when his time will have come in the closing chapters. These clues not only lead us on, but they become like a kind of stitching, connecting one scene to the next. John also leads on with his rhetorical questions. For example, in John 11:56, he says, "They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, 'What do you think? Isn't he coming to the festivals?'" Well, we all know he's coming. Of course he is. It gives us a kind of handrail to progress our expectation of what's coming next. So these are some of the ways John does his craft. Is it not beautiful? We can only but wonder of the work of God's Holy Spirit in the text here. So that's all, by the way, background to this book, which was the first of our 2 goals. And I'm hoping we can tick off that one for now. We are more than halfway done now. So if you want to pause and stretch your legs, now would be a good time to do that. I'm going to get something to drink. I'll see you in a moment. Okay, it's time to get into our second goal. That is, how do we go about studying this book? This turns out to be quite difficult. One of the leading commentators says quite bleakly that there is disarray and disagreement on how to study the book. Well, we're not going to let us hold this back. Here we're going to consider 2 things, also starting with the letter C to help us remember. First, we will consider what is the characterization of the gospel. That is, how do we approach it? What kind of literature is it? Then we will consider our second C, the composition of the book. This involves putting together some kind of outline of the book so that we have a structure for actually studying it. So let's start then with the characterization of this book. How can we describe it? How many times have you heard someone say, "You're joking"? Now, if you can't tell that someone's joking, you're going to miss the whole point, of course. We must thus have some way of understanding of John's actual intentions of how we should view his gospel. Now, anyone reading the gospel for the first time will notice it is a story, perhaps a novel, or even a collection of shorter stories. Some stories we read of only here, such as the wedding of Cana and the raising of Lazarus. John gives us lots of details to make stories come alive. Because of the uniqueness of John's Gospel, some people have considered the book as a spiritual story only, not intended to be taken literally. But I've got a problem with that, because I think John gives us details precisely because he wants it to be a credible witness of an actual story about real people. I think his witness is credible and can be trusted. The wonder of the Gospel is that the Holy Spirit uses this factual eyewitness story in a way which is rich and deep in spiritual meaning. And to me, it points to the Holy Spirit as being the real author of this book, which is spiritually deep, yet embedded in an actual eyewitness account. But John makes no attempt to tell us the whole story of Jesus' life. In fact, he says it's impossible to do that. And he leaves out many stories, like the Nativity, the Ascension. He doesn't even give us a genealogy. Instead, he crams in details of specific stories. He's very selective of what to include. I've counted the verses, and by my calculations, 88% of the verses relate to only 8 events, which we will call the seasons in our study. But I can't help notice that it sometimes seems like a play, with its fast-paced dialogue and swift changes from one scene to the next. The Greeks, of course, gave us the theatre. If we do think the Gospel looks like a play, the Greek play would surely have been John's reference. Greek plays were performed by a small group of actors who wore masks for the different characters of the play. I'm no expert on this, but it seemed to me that the skill was more in the oratory and the gestures rather than acting as we know it today. It was dramatized storytelling. Now, John's Gospel has surprising similarities to the Greek tragedy in particular, which is one of the 2 main forms of Greek plays. We can see this in the similarities of the themes of human suffering, unjust treatment of the hero, and also a focus on important things like wisdom and truth and life. But one very interesting parallel I must point out as a bit of a side comment is in the setting of these plays. Greek plays were staged annually at massive multi-day festivals in open-air amphitheaters. Thousands of men only, it seems, attended. The plays were performed as a part of an annual religious festival for worshipping Greek pagan gods during springtime. Now, of course, that reminds us immediately of the annual gathering of Jews, men, to worship God, which took place 3 times a year at the temple, but especially over the Passover festival, which also takes place in spring. And more than half of John's Gospel is told during the annual Passover festival. Interesting, but let's hold on to that thought. Okay, so we've got these 2 ways of looking at the text. One as a story or as a novel, and a second as a kind of a play or something in between, perhaps a dramatized story. Now, any writer needs to decide how to publish his or her work. Should it be an ebook or a YouTube video? If we had to ask John what medium he planned to use, we might be surprised. He tells us that the gospel is his testimony. A testimony, of course, is usually given orally. Nowadays, we're used to reading silently on our own, but this is a relatively new development. St. Augustine even tells us and left us a note to tell us how surprised he was when he observed one of the bishops reading silently. In the 1st century AD, it would be unheard of for someone to read a book silently, but oratory came naturally to the Greeks. One historian has noted that the spoken word came to life for the Greeks, while the written symbol was just dull symbols written down. The purpose of writing was not so much to communicate, but to record the communication. Perhaps even hundreds of Greek plays have been lost precisely because they weren't preserved in writing. So I think we should see the text mainly as a record of what was intended to be spoken out loud. It's a subtle distinction, but it makes a difference. I think we can see something of this in John's famous description of Jesus as the Word or the Logos, which was there in the beginning with God and became flesh. The commands of God were, of course, captured in the stone tablets in the Torah, but this perhaps was a waiting for the main actor, Jesus, to come on the stage, the Logos, to bring the words of God, to act out the love story of God before us. So I think the gospel is meant to be spoken, but that's still not enough. Whether a play or a novel, we need some approach to studying this book based on what John actually had in mind. Now, I can see at least 5 ways to study the gospel, and I'd like to summarize these for you now, as quickly as we can. One way to see it is as a courtroom drama, with Jesus as the accused. The drama starts in chapter 1 with John the Baptist as the first witness. Witnesses are carefully arranged to testify. When you read the gospel with this in mind, it does seem obvious that we are indeed looking at a courtroom drama, and the case is about deciding whether Jesus truly is God's Son. Another way is to look at the I am statements of Jesus, as previously discussed. When we make these I am sayings the centerpiece of our study, I think we'll find large parts of the gospel can be arranged around these sayings. This is also about understanding who Jesus truly is and how we can come to him. A third way we can see the book is as a kind of retelling of the Genesis creation story in which God creates a new man through Jesus. The book is full of references back to the Genesis story. When we read, "In the beginning was the Word," of course we immediately think of Genesis 1. In John's story, Jesus becomes that light that shone on day 1 of creation, even before God created the sun on day 3. And when Jesus says it's finished, it reminds us of God's word when he finished creation on the 7th day. If you look hard enough, you can find other signs too, like the gardener by the tomb, and Jesus miraculously breathing on his disciples in John 20, which reminds us of Genesis 2, in which man is brought to life by God's breath. Now, these parallels seem to be telling us that Jesus has come to bring a new life for those who are born again. A fourth way to study the gospel is to see that it is almost like a telling of a new Passover story, and I think we've laid some groundwork for us to understand why this could be the case. One thing that Greeks and Jews shared was a love for storytelling. Scripture, of course, would be read out loud at the great festivals and especially during Passover. Exodus chapter 13 gives the instruction to commemorate the escape from Egypt. In verse 2 we read, "Then Moses said to the people, 'Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand.'" And then in verse 8 we read, "On that day tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt." Passover is a time for storytelling. It traditionally involves a recollection done around the table, with participants becoming part of this annual storytelling and remembering the wonder of the stories of escape from Egypt and across the wilderness. This makes me wonder whether John had in mind a continuation of these traditions of sacred storytelling, but in which we listen to the story of the glorious new covenant, a story which uses the many symbols of Jesus we find in the gospel. Jesus is the Passover lamb, the manna from heaven, our living spring of water, our way out of the desert, our rescue from the serpent which bites us, and the tabernacle where we can meet with God. If you're not convinced about this, think of the fact that most of the gospel story takes place during the Passover festivals, and that Jesus is the Passover lamb killed at the very time when Passover lambs were being sacrificed. And ponder this strange fact that John uses the narrator to tell his stories, just as stories have been told for millennia around the tables of family sharing a Passover meal. When we sit with John at his new Passover meal, you hear stories told by his narrator to all of us around the table, with us all chipping in as the story is told, helping us to remember of God's love and how he's brought us to freedom and salvation through his Son. Well, that's my take on that. You can agree with me or not if you like. The final way to think of the Gospel of John is simply as a collection of stories, or even as a play with multiple acts. But I can see a repeated pattern for these stories, which makes us think he intended it to be read this way. Each narrative builds up towards a particular event at a location, for example, the wedding in Cana or the festival in Jerusalem. It describes what happened at the event, and afterwards we see the consequence of what happened. For example, we read in chapter 2, it was almost time for Passover. That signals a new season. Then we read what happened in Jerusalem during Passover. Then we read in chapter 4 that Jesus was welcomed home by fellow Galileans because of what he did at the Passover. It's all one narrative related to the Passover. Now, each narrative includes just one sign or miracle done by Jesus to show us that he is sent by God. John weaves these signs into the text to give us the subject for dialogue and teaching. Now, for every season except one, he chooses just one sign when he could have chosen many as a way to teach us. I think this gives us a more natural reading than if we simply divide the gospel into chapter by chapter, because John treats these events holistically, and we can lose the theme if we just tackle them chapter by chapter. These stories are sandwiched between an epilogue and a prologue, which give us a kind of outline for a Greek play. So these are the 5 ways I can think of, and probably there are more. I think that all of these methods are valid, but that's truly the wonder of the gospel. It seems like a bisecting of planes which come together and allow us to see these different ways of seeing the gospel, even though all of them are truthful. I think it's wonderful. So we are nearly done. It's time to consider the final C, the composition of John. What are the pieces into which it's composed, and how can we slice up the text for studying? Well, we need to pick a method for studying the text, and the one we will use in this study is the last mentioned signs and seasons framework, which sees the gospel as a collection of narratives or seasons with an associated sign for each season. There are 8 narratives in total, so let's review quickly this breakdown, as this is going to be the study for our study of the gospel. The prologue is found in chapter 1, which sets the scene for what to expect and looks forward to the Passover lamb. Then we have the first narrative, a wedding in John 2. From John 2 through to John 4, we have the story of Jesus' first Passover in which he's rejected. John 5 takes us to an unknown festival, while John 6 is at a second Passover. John 7 through to 10 is set at the festival of the harvest. The second part of John 10 takes place at the festival of Hanukkah. Then in John 11 we have an interesting funeral. The long passage from John 12 through to John 20 takes place at the third Passover. This is an interrupted Passover because Jesus did not actually celebrate Passover as is often assumed. Instead, he was the Passover lamb for the final Passover. And finally, we have the epilogue in John 21. So these are the acts of our play, or the seasons of John's Gospel. Then we come to the signs associated with these seasons. Traditionally, it's said that the book has 7 signs, but nowhere does John say there are 7 signs. Knowing John, that shouldn't surprise us. But I think John does have 7 in mind, with 7 being the number of perfection. The first 2 signs are obvious. John calls them signs 1 and 2. These are the miracle at the wedding of Cana and the healing of the official's son. John makes us anticipate a certain number of signs by starting to count them. Then there are 4 miracles which follow, which are either named as a sign or implied as a sign, because the crowds immediately afterwards are commenting about the signs that Jesus has done. And I think it's clear that John wants us to count these 4 miracles also. These 4 are the multiplication of the loaves and bread, the healing of the invalid by the pool, the healing of a blind man, and the raising of Lazarus. That gives us 6 signs. But where is the 7th? Some think it is Jesus walking on the water, but John doesn't claim this as a sign, and it's not really a public miracle, so I don't think this is correct. I think the 7th sign is the resurrection of Jesus himself. In the temple cleansing in chapter 2, Jesus responds to a request for a sign by prophesying of his resurrection after 3 days, and I think it's clear that this is the 7th sign. The purpose of signs is to convince us that Jesus was sent by God, and of all the signs, none is more convincing than the resurrection. Now, the 7th sign stands out from the other 6 in a few ways. The first signs ultimately fail to generate true belief. By John 12, it seems we have reached the end of the time for Jesus himself to do the signs. The transition verse is John 12:37, which says, even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. Even the 12 disciples didn't quite grasp things up to this point. Only after the resurrection did the disciples fully comprehend. The 7th sign is what finally brought people into a firm belief. But the 7th sign differs in yet another way. All of the other 6 miracles have some kind of counterpart in the Old Testament, but not so for the 7th sign. Never before has anyone been raised from the dead and given a new body. It's a truly remarkable sign which stands on its own as a promise of new life in Jesus. The whole gospel story stands on the truth of the 7th sign, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, as mentioned, all of the signs in the gospel match up to a corresponding season, and conversely, every season has one sign, with the exception of the Feast of Hanukkah, which we can get to later. But it means we have a wonderful framework to explore the gospel by looking at these 8 seasons and their corresponding 7 signs. And so it's time to wrap up. To summarize, we have looked at the overview of the book by looking at its content and its context and the wonderful craft of the book. Now, hopefully that will help you in your study. We've also considered ways in which we can study it, and we've chosen a free framework for our own study. And that's it for this session. Maybe this is a good time to think about reading through the gospel if you haven't done so recently. Feel free to post comments or raise questions online. Let me know too if you think I've got anything wrong, and I'd really appreciate your feedback. For those of you doing the online study, I look forward to getting into the text with you in our first live stream session, where we will look at the prologue of John chapter 1. My prayer for you in this study are the words of Jesus in John chapter 10 and verse 10, where he says, "I come that we may have life and have it abundantly." May you experience life, abundant life, as you draw close to Jesus, the Jesus that we find in this wonderful gospel. Thank you.